I'm Nick Westergaard, and this is On Brand, helping you tell your story. My guest this week is Thaler Pekar.
Sometimes the brand is obvious and we're looking for the small stories that exemplify the brand. And sometimes the brand is more hidden. It might be brand new, and we need to gather the stories to then determine what the through line is.
Thaler Pekar is a communication pioneer, lauded as one of the world's leading experts on institutional storytelling. For 18 years, she and her team at Thaler Pekar Partners have advised visionary leaders worldwide on gaining confidence, insight, and influence. My interview with Thaler Pekar is coming right up. But first,
you may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? Jeff Livingston and Greg Verdino host a great podcast called No Brainer, an AI podcast for marketers. That's useful. Gentlemen, tell us what listeners will get out of the show.
We discuss all the latest developments that are happening in marketing and AI, particularly the news that's impacting us on our day-to-day basis.
And we break it down and we help marketers see through the hype cycle, and we analyze what's happening through the lens of a couple of guys who have been around in the marketing space for a while.
Then we do a no-brainer and a brainer, 2 takeaways for you to walk off and implement in your daily marketing life.
And then we help you make sense of how to implement it by getting practical and helping brands and agencies think about how to implement AI in their organizations to benefit their companies and their customers.
Awesome. And where can people subscribe?
Find us at nobrainerpodcast.com. Of course, you can find us at marketingpodcasts.net and look for No Brainer any place you listen to your podcasts.
You heard him. Go subscribe. You probably know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? I'm Jason Falls, and I host Winfluence, the Influence Marketing Podcast. Now, you'll note I didn't say influencer marketing. I said influence marketing. Why? Because the goal is to truly influence an audience to take action. We talk about the strategies and stories that move beyond engaging just social media influencers and tap into your community to find influential voices. It's a different way of looking at it. We call it community commerce marketing. Influencers are still a piece of it, but there's so much more. I talk to creators, brand and agency side marketers, and the thinkers in the space to help grow your business. Come learn with me on Winfluence, the Influence Marketing Podcast. Find it at winfluencepod.com, marketingpodcasts.net, or search for Winfluence wherever you get your podcasts.
Thaler Pekar, welcome to On Brand.
Nick, it is a delight and an honor to be here.
You know, institutional storytelling sounds like a simple category, but both of those words seem like they could be kind of complex corn mazes to end up in, to say nothing of putting them together. So we're getting to know each other at a conference. You say you help with institutional storytelling. Someone says, what does that look like? What does the work of that look like? I started with the easy questions.
And I thank you for that. Institutional storytelling means that we are connecting the big story of the institution, the overarching big story, which you could call the narrative, to the smaller stories that are shared by marketing, advertising, by the executive leadership, by all the staff, and by the customers, by the people on the street who are talking about the brand. And so that's my distinction between individual storytelling, which some might think of as, a TED Talk or something like that, versus this idea of institutional, that there is an intention and that the leaders are speaking on behalf of the organization. I'll give you an example. We had the great pleasure of working with the leader of one of the biggest retail brands in the world. And I was working with him at this critical point of growth in the organization and in a new marketing push. How did his leadership stories connect to the brand narrative? So I talk about storytelling, but I also want to make it clear that one of the things that Thaler Pekar Partners does that I believe is somewhat unique is that we focus a lot on listening. So we not only talk about how you share a story, but how do you hear the stories from your colleagues, your customers, from people out on the street, from people using your service or your product.
So it's really interesting to think about because you mentioned leaders, you mentioned the role of brand and advertising, and it also makes me think of just people on the front lines delivering your product, your service, whether that's in a retail environment or others. And boy, there's a lot of parties involved there, and that's what
Mm.
I think when I first read that institutional storytelling
Mm.
in your bio, it made me think, boy, there's a lot of parties to get on the same page. Where do you start with something like that?
One other thing that we've done in this realm of institutional storytelling is we worked with the storied brand Kiehl's, which is part of L'Oreal. And we worked with the people who lead they don't call them salespeople, but the customer service people and the representatives in the Kiehl stores worldwide. And we worked with them to learn how to ask customers for stories. So that when customers came in, one of the great things about story is that it's a way to say things that you wouldn't say in any other way, right? You can share a story that contains values and emotions and facts, and it's all in one little package. And by helping your customers share a story, you learn more about what they want and what they need. And so our focus isn't simply on telling stories, but also asking for and listening to and making sense of those stories. So to your point, Nick, yeah, everybody's involved.
Well, and say more about Kiehl's, because I think that there's something in kind of the I kind of hang my hat on story also, but I think it's fair to call it that there's a fair amount of story and storytelling Kool-Aid out there in the business world. And I think sometimes you hear something like that, it can feel just surface level of ask your customers for story. And especially when you're talking about front lines of a retail experience, that is a big lift and not always in a comfort zone from the general ask, but when you almost reformat the question, the conversation, I'm curious to know what did that look like? Were there choices in language?
Very much so. Kiehl's is a glorious brand, and they're very committed to the idea of hospitality and generosity. One of the things we did with them was we had a lot of fun doing improv games that were about giving and receiving gifts to get people into this mindset of hospitality and asking for a story. We're not saying to do it simply to be or to be at all transactional, like to get something from someone. But to be transformative, to allow people to be heard, to allow people to put together their own thoughts and feelings and facts in a package and to guide them on a journey of discovery about themselves and what they like, don't like, what they want. And that's hospitable. That kind of listening is incredible. People don't often get to be heard in that way.
That's such a good point too, and I think that some of these things can feel like the business buzzwords, and someone on the front lines can feel I don't know how to do that. But what you just described is something that is kind of taking it back to a core of who the brand really is. So it makes me think that as you talk about institutional storytelling, does there have to be something like with the Kiehl's example with hospitality? so something that you can sort of hook into at the brand's core essence that is part of the almost the story gambit?
There always is. Sometimes the brand is obvious and we're looking for the small stories that exemplify the brand. And sometimes the brand is more hidden. It might be brand new. We might be launching a business or an idea or a service organization or nonprofit, and we need to gather the stories to then determine what the through line is.
That's fascinating to think about, and all of those points of connection. And it makes me think, are you typically, I hate the hierarchical frame on this question, but it seems like there's a real balance of top down, bottom up. And knowing that I don't like that frame going into it, feel free to replace it. But how do you approach the internal dynamics there?
It helps when there is a leader who is equitable and understands that listening up, down, and across the organization is important, as well as listening at the edges, because that's where all the sexy work is being done, right? When you think you think of biosystems, and that's where the innovation and the changes and the morphing is occurring at the edges of the stories, at the edges of the maps of our narratives. So we have a tool, a trademark tool called the Narrative Garden. And that's a way to look at the stories that are being told that you want to grow and the stories that you want to tamp down on, the stories that you want to nurture or plant. And also to think about where are the edges of that garden and what's happening at the edges and at the intersection of all of these stories. And that's a very useful tool for seeing holistically what your brand is. It could also be applied to a product or to an advocacy action. We've used it with people who are doing campaign work as well. Let me give you another example, if I can, Nick, and maybe it helps. We worked with a large foundation that had been funding an area for 5 years, a very significant multi-million-dollar investment. And they were pulling out of that funding, but they wanted the grantees to continue to do the work. And so they brought them all together, and we ran what we call a participatory narrative program. So we had all of these grantees share their stories and then make sense of the stories themselves to find what the big story of this 5-year investment was. So it wasn't the hierarchical foundation saying, this is what we did, because come on, they don't really know as well as the people who are doing the work. And it takes the collective coming together and making sense together of what the message is, of what the work was, and what's the message that they were going to continue forward to continue to get funding and to continue to do the work.
That's such a great point, too. And I'm glad you brought up the advocacy side of this, because I think that it is, we talk about the business of storytelling, but the importance and the fit in advocacy work. And I think, I always am quick to say, as a small professional services provider, that all of the smart folks talk about working with only one kind of business, that it should be, I should be focusing on brand building for small dental practices in the Pacific Northwest to make my millions. But I love the variety of clients and think that they really can inform one another. Do you find that in kind of moving between those worlds?
I'm smiling ear to ear. Thank you. I would hug you if you were in front of me. Yeah, we were cross sector, and we do get that hit of people saying, well, don't you only work with this, or don't you only work with that, or how could you work with nonprofits when you work with foundations, or how can you work
Yeah.
with companies? Um, our lives are complex. People are complex. I wrote a book years ago, was pitching a book, and offered the book to a publisher who said, we will take the book. It was primarily a publisher who worked with nonprofits. And they said, as long as you take out all the business examples.
Huh.
And I said, listen, every business person I know, every successful business person is on the board, if not the president of a nonprofit board. Our lives cross over. We go to hospitals, we go to colleges, we send our kids to colleges. These are nonprofit institutions. It's not that simple. And especially now, we've got B Corps, we've got triple bottom line, we've got things that are morphing. So I think that they all influence each other. Some of the most innovative work is being done in the government space.
On Brand will be right back after this.
As a person with a very deep voice, I'm hired all the time for advertising campaigns. But a deep voice doesn't sell B2B, and advertising on the wrong platform doesn't sell B2B either. That's why if you're a B2B marketer, you should use LinkedIn ads. LinkedIn has the targeting capabilities to help you reach the world's largest professional audience. That's right, over 70 million decision makers all in one place. All the big wigs, then medium wigs, also small wigs who are on the path to becoming big wigs. Okay, that's enough about wigs. LinkedIn ads allows you to focus on getting your B2B message to the right people. So, does that mean you should use ads on LinkedIn instead of hiring me, the man with the deepest voice in the world? Yes. Yes, it does. Get started today and see why LinkedIn is the place to be to be. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Go to linkedin.com/MPN to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/MPN. Terms and conditions apply.
Support for On Brand and all shows on the Marketing Podcast Network is provided by ActiveCampaign. With ActiveCampaign, you can create and send email campaigns, manage your leads and customers, create landing pages, set up automated workflows, and track your results all in one approachable platform. It's no wonder ActiveCampaign has over 185,000 happy customers across the globe, such as the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. They integrate Salesforce with ActiveCampaign to automate a thank you email to all those who visit the museum, and in doing so, share a form to gather their feedback. That then automatically triggers follow-up messages based on the feedback they receive, including returning to the museum for another visit. For a limited time, ActiveCampaign is offering on-brand listeners a chance to double your contacts for free when you sign up at activecampaign.com/activate. That means if your email list has 10,000 contacts, you only need to pay for 5,000. Or you can pay for the 10,000 and get an extra 10,000 contacts totally free. Go to activecampaign.com/activate to sign up today. That's activecampaign.com/activate. Terms and conditions apply. Now, back to the show. I love that point about, I've never used, because I'm also smiling ear to ear as we talk about this, because I've gotten it too. It's like, yeah, show me all the other medium-sized manufacturers that you've worked with. And I love your example too of business CEOs are on nonprofit boards, and these are porous worlds, and I'm not sure exactly where this focus came from. I mean, like I said, there's an obvious business case of that ideal target industry and something that you're really good at. But at the same time, I think that there's great power in seeing these examples and even grabbing them and taking them over. I mean, I think of, an analogy being a form of a story. And, why
Mm,
wouldn't someone that is that has an accounting practice not want to be the Jose Andres of accounting, and that means something, and that's kind of a
mm,
directional hook that you can use to get oriented, but you only see that if you kind of widen your view. And I think for whatever reason, there's a real hesitancy on doing that. Maybe the other feels safe.
mm. Jose Andres brought another smile to my face. Uh, I mean, it's a nonprofit run in the most entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah.
And he's a role model to so many people. I've spent decades going into organizations and asking, tell me perhaps a story about a time you met a challenge and overcame it. And of course, when I'm in a business or a nonprofit, you want the person to tell the story about their professional work. But a lot of times, the first thing that comes to mind for a leader or the story they really want to tell, and the story they're taking their leadership um, uh, inspiration from, is the story of overcoming cancer or the story of running that marathon that they trained for 2 years to run. Those are valid stories, even if they're not the story about uh, pulling the organization out from bankruptcy or getting the product out in time.
That's such a great point, and I think too, as we um, as we think about this, and like you said with Jose Andres, it's like kind of exactly what that means to be that, and I get what she's going for if that's her goal with her accounting practice, and some of those hooks can be really valuable. Speaking of valuable hooks, and looking at your website, I can't believe that I blasted past the fact that you can ask for a beer in 12 different languages. So when we say diversity of clients with your work, we're not just talking about both nonprofit, foundational advocacy, business work. You've got some international scope, and I would say with that, it feels like a relative to that conversation that we were just having, because I feel like it can maybe sound a little corny, but I feel like are there similarities that you notice working across all of these different countries in human nature, in what drives us?
Yeah, people are complex and beautiful and nuanced and paradoxical and generally want to do the right thing and are trying their best to do the right thing. Um, Most people are curious, not everybody, not as much as I would like everybody to be curious. Um, but people want to be heard and people want to hear other people. And as an overarching ethos, that's what I believe. And that's what we're working towards a world where everybody can be heard and understood, and where everybody has the opportunity to hear other people. And I add that last piece on because in the modern world, there's not always space for that. And people need to be not just taught how to listen, but given the space and the bandwidth to listen. That's not something that's readily available to all of us. It's not something that a lot of institutions encourage or create the time for people to really be heard.
That's such a good point, because I feel like there's something that we've kind of nudged up against a few different ways, and it's kind of that comfort in knowing what we know, staying in our industry, staying in our lane. We
Mm,
don't want to look beyond that, but also that the idea that feels very much of the right now is that we don't want to stop and listen. And I don't know if that
Mhm.
comes from, inbox zero productivity or what it is, but it's that space that you're talking about creating, and all of these big ideas, story and so forth. It's all dependent um, on giving that space. It almost seems, I don't want to tell you what a first step would be, but as we kind of come full circle with all of this, is listening? Is there a step that comes before listening?
Oh, that's a really good question. Um, yeah, I think that people don't listen because they themselves are not heard.
Oh,
So when I went on this focus on listening, when I really started to focus on listening being half of the equation in communication, and started doing a listening program around the world, and I was surprised that what we learned was that people were not listening because they themselves were not heard. That I thought when I asked people, how much time are you spending listening to others, I would get a small number, which I did. But when I asked people, and it's obvious, Nick, right? I'm saying this aloud and I'm realizing how ignorant I sound. They themselves weren't heard.
yeah.
And so you need to be heard first. And I understand that that's meta or circular, however you want to describe that. But yeah, you need to be heard in order to understand how to listen.
Well, and I think that's the danger with a lot of these concepts. Like you said, you even kind of brushed off. I sound, I it sounds elementary, and it's like these things are so simple, and we're missing them almost constantly for all of the. It's swimming upstream, so even these simple ideas aren't quite standing out, or not standing out, but it's something that we're not looking at the level that we should. It seems. Listening,
Mm-hmm.
and that, yeah, it's literally half the equation.
One of the joys I've had in having the firm for 18 years is building upon the wisdom that we glean and the wisdom that our clients are generous enough to share with us. And we've moved into doing a tremendous amount of oral history work and story collection gathering. And the great thing about that is it enables us to combine all of this foci. So it's enables us to listen to people and really let them be heard and let them make sense of what they're saying, and to make sense of what they're saying alongside their colleagues who are being interviewed for these institutional oral histories as well. And to then be able to find that through line in all of the stories that we're gathering, all of the oral histories, and be able to report back on that through line to the sponsoring institution.
That is such a great point, and it's going to be our point to end on. I've smiled several times throughout this conversation, but now, Thaler, it is my joy to get to ask you for a brand that has made you smile recently.
So I'd like to bring up more of a branding tactic here, Nick, and that's the Barbenheimer.
Ah.
I think that Barbenheimer is fantastic. Right? You're taking two movies. You're taking Barbie, which is outrageously designed and in many ways a classic road trip movie, and you're taking Oppenheimer, which is also gorgeous to look at, and it's complex and there's so many characters. And I think that putting these two together and seeing it take off so much is testament to the fact that people are able to hold two concepts side by side.
Yeah.
And people are complex, and people really like stories and storylines here of the Barbenheimer that reflect how complex and nuanced and paradoxical their own lives are. I mean, it's respect for people being able to discern and appreciate nuance, science, politics, complexity, discussions of individualism and collectivism, complex systems design, disruption, all at once.
Yeah.
It makes me very happy to see it.
I love it. And yeah, and I think it's a classic example too of a high tide raises all ships, which boy, we say a lot, but we don't always see great examples of that. And I think that this is really something to see there as well. Thaler, where can folks go to learn more about who you are and what you do?
The website is thalerpekar.com, ThalerPekar. And then we're on all the socials. Thaler Pekar Partners is on LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads, Facebook. We're there.
All of the things. Well, we will link up to that in our show notes, which folks can always find at onbrandpodcast.com. Thaler Pekar, thanks for being on brand with us.
Thank you, Nick.
On Brand is part of the Marketing Podcast Network. If you like what you're hearing, if we've made you smile, you can always listen free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your favorite platform may be. And please take a moment and rate and review the podcast to help others find the show. Until next week, I'm Nick Westergaard, and I'll see you on the internet.
This podcast is heard along the Marketing Podcast Network. For more great marketing podcasts, visit marketingpodcasts.net.